Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Tom.
Oh, today is our all-English lecture. So we're going to try not to speak any Chinese. There's no Chinese teacher. Tom, we need to talk a little bit more slowly and clearly. And if you use a phrase like an idiom or slang, you better stop and explain that. We've got some fun stories today. One is about my former city. I used to live in New York City, and wow, the water around New York City, Manhattan is an island, and the water was really dirty. In fact, there's water on the west side and the east side. The East River was worse than the west, but they were both gross. And no one would ever actually, want to swim in that water because it was gross. I did see some people who would try to fish sometimes, and I thought, don't eat that stuff. It's really gross in that water. We're going to talk about that, but we're also going to come back and talk about some domestic news, which is about China Airlines. What do you know about that, Tom?
There was a strike, as you know, over the Chinese New Year. And, of course, if you're trying to travel during that time and enjoy a vacation, that can kind of put a halt to your plans.
Yeah.
If the plane's not going to be taking off. So, of course, lots of people were affected by that. And it could be a problem in the future if they did not settle the problem properly. So we're going to talk about these two news items in today's lesson about the oysters in New York Harbor, how they're going to clean it up. And we're going to talk about that pilot strike that occurred during Chinese New Year just a couple of months ago. So let's get to it. Let's read the entire contents of our lesson right now. How the humble oyster could revive New York Harbor. New York City's harbor is not known for having the cleanest waters, but now the city is hoping to revive its old marine ecosystems by bringing back the sea creatures that originally sustained them, oysters. Since 2014, Billion Oyster Project has been working to create new oyster reefs that will transform the waters around New York City. Reintroducing these mollusks brings myriad benefits, including their natural ability to clean seawater. A single adult oyster can filter 190 liters of water a day. Imagine what a billion could do. The oyster reefs will also shelter sea life while providing natural breakwaters that protect the shoreline from storm surges and erosion. The people at Billion Oyster Project have a big job, but they aren't alone. The organization has partnered with over 70 restaurants around New York City, which donate oyster shells to be reused as homes for new oysters. More than 75 public schools have joined the effort, too, teaching students to track oysters and water quality. The project is already making a difference, and soon the waters of New York Harbor may be thriving once again.
China Airlines pilots strike for better conditions. If you were traveling during the Chinese New Year vacation this year, you may have been affected by the China Airlines pilot strike. More than 600 pilots working for the company went on strike starting February 8th to call for more reasonable working hours and better staffed flights. Pilots complained of being overworked to the point of exhaustion and illness, which poses an increased danger of accidents. The pilots' union Taoyuan put forth 5 demands, including additional backup pilots for long-haul flights. The union and the airline reached a deal on February 14th, with the airline agreeing to fulfill many of the union's demands. As the strike occurred during the peak season for Taiwanese travelers, more than 20,000 passengers were affected by flight delays or cancellations. Public reactions ranged from sympathy for overworked pilots to fury over the effect the strike had on travel plans. Travel agencies have also asked that China Airlines compensate affected passengers. With the strike now over, the airline and its workers Hope for smoother flights going forward.
All right, everybody, it's time for us to discuss our featured news stories today. First of all, we're going to talk about the humble oyster. This, of course, is usually just referred to as an oyster, which is a mollusk, a kind of creature that has a shell usually. And, of course, oysters are quite popular here in Taiwan. You break open the shell and you can eat the meat inside. That's what an oyster is. But we're describing this oyster as being humble, which means it's just a very simple creature living in the ocean. It's not trying to hurt anybody. It's just there living, minding its own business. But we're talking about how this simple, humble oyster could revive New York Harbor. To revive means to give something life again after it's kind of been taken away. You could use this to describe people who almost drown, for example. If you give them mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, you could revive them so they don't have to die. They can, survive and recover and live again. But, of course, New York is a very big city with lots of ships and lots of pollution. So New York Harbor is polluted. It's dirty. It's disgusting. It smells bad. But we're thinking of ways to use an oyster to actually save New York Harbor.
Yeah.
And return it to its original condition.
It's kind of interesting to think of an oyster as actually like cleaning up the water and then you're eating that oyster that's been cleaning the water. It's kind of gross. I'm not a fan of oysters, I'm just going to say. I know a lot of people like seafood here. So the humble oyster, we're going to rely on the oyster to help clean the waters around New York. We've got two main rivers. There are more rivers there in that area, but mostly you hear about the Hudson River on the west and the East River on the east. The East River's gross. It's worse than the Hudson, but they're both dirty. So I like that they're thinking about how to clean it up naturally.
Indeed.
We're not using chemicals. We're actually going back to natural ways to clean the ecosystems. So they're going to bring back the sea creatures that originally sustained the waters there. Of course, if you have a river or a lake and you have fish or other marine animals, once people get involved, usually they overfish or they catch too many of these little sea creatures and pretty soon they're gone. So there's nothing left to clean the waters naturally. So we're trying to fix that, I guess.
Right, and bring back the old marine ecosystem, which, of course, New York Harbor is right next to the ocean there. So I suppose you got a mixture of fresh water coming down the river and water coming in from the ocean. So you've got an interesting ecosystem there with different kinds of plants and animals surviving together as a system. And they want to bring back these sea creatures that originally sustained these ecosystems, the sea creatures that originally were helping to preserve those ecosystems. Oysters. Oysters played an important role in that ecosystem. And since 2014, about 5 years ago, Billion Oyster Project has been working to create new oyster reefs that will transform the waters around New York City. So this is an organization called Billion Oyster Project, and they want to create new oyster reefs. So if you know about oysters, they kind of cluster together in a reef in one particular area. It helps them grow and things like that. So, of course, if you have these new reefs, then it will transform the waters. It will change the ecosystem of the water. So if we have these oyster reefs, it should help clean up the waters of New York Harbor. Notice waters there with an S on it. If you're talking about different bodies of water, then you can use it that way. I would say that yes, you've got different areas of the river. The Hudson River between Manhattan and New Jersey. Then you've got the Lower Harbor where the Statue of Liberty is. And then you've got the East River and the various other bodies of water around Long Island. So yes, it's a pretty complex ecosystem there with lots of different areas.
Cool. So they're going to create these new oyster reefs, as Tom said, that will transform the waters around New York. It's kind of interesting. Usually when you see this word reef, you're talking about coral reefs that you can go and scuba dive or use even a mask and fins to see underneath the water. Usually it's kind of beautiful. I'm not a big scuba diver person. I don't scuba dive, but This is the way they like to grow, as Tom said, in little groups. And hopefully they will transform the waters and make the water, or waters because it's plural there, around New York City much cleaner. So we're going to reintroduce. Notice there's a re in front of that word. So long ago, oysters were there naturally, but because they've been overfished or overcaught by fishermen, they're not there naturally. So we're going to reintroduce or put them back into the water. As Tom said, they're mollusks and they bring myriad benefits. Myriad is kind of a, I think, more difficult word. You don't see it very often, but it just means countless or extremely great number of something. Here we're using it as an adjective. It's also used as a measure word. So a lot of times you'll see myriad used like this. For example, I could say we're reintroducing these mollusks which bring a myriad of benefits to the waters around New York City. So myriad here is an adjective. So they actually are going to clean the seawater for us. This is the statistic that just blows my mind. A single adult oyster, and they're not big, right? They kind of fit into the palm of your hand. They can filter 190 liters of water a day. That's amazing. Imagine then in your mind what 1 billion of those little things could do. That's amazing.
Yep, they could filter the water. The water flows through them, and then they keep the bad things behind. Maybe they eat them, who knows. And the oyster reefs will also shelter sea life while providing natural breakwaters that protect the shoreline from storm surges and erosion. So yes, indeed, they'll protect the shoreline. We've got breakwaters here. That's usually something out in the water that stops waves from coming in. And, of course, you get storm surges. When a storm comes, the waves come in, so that's more water. And erosion, the water comes in and washes away the shoreline. That's erosion. That's a problem in a lot of places. So hopefully they can stop that from happening. And, of course, the verb form of that is to erode. And, of course, erosion is the noun. Now, the people at Billion Oyster Project have a big job, but they aren't alone. Other people are helping them out. The organization has partnered with over 70 restaurants around New York City, which donate oyster shells to be reused as homes for new oysters. Isn't that generous? So they're partnering with these other restaurants. They're working together with them as partners. And those restaurants, which, serve seafood, and they've got those oyster shells that they don't need anymore. They're going to donate those shells to this project, and then those shells will be used as new homes for oysters in New York Harbor. That sounds very beneficial to both parties. And more than 75 public schools have also joined the effort, teaching students to track oysters and water quality. So yes, they're getting the kids involved with this as well. Lots of school students at public schools are tracking the oysters. I guess they've got numbers on them and keeping track of them, making sure they're okay. And they're also testing the water quality to see if those oysters are actually cleaning the water.
One of the things that our news story doesn't mention is when people will actually be able to start eating oysters from the harbor around New York City. I don't like oysters to begin with, but they're very, very popular, especially at very gourmet restaurants, especially raw oysters. They're not cheap either, Tom. We're calling it a humble oyster in the title, but actually if you order oysters to eat, especially raw oysters at fancy restaurants, they can be quite expensive.
And the oyster shells, of course, can be used in a lot of different places too, but that's another subject. But we're talking about this Billion Oyster Project, and the project is already making a difference, and soon the waters of New York Harbor may be thriving once again.
Good.
We certainly wish them the best of luck. Okay, we're going to continue in just a couple of seconds here, but let's take a break. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back. We shall now continue with our News Watch lesson for today. Again, it's our all-English lecture, so No words from other languages in today's lesson, especially Chinese. Even though I just would love to speak Chinese, it would help you so much if I could just tell you in Chinese what this stuff means, but can't do that today. We're going to do it all in English. And our next story here is about pilots, people who fly airplanes, jets, helicopters, etc. More specifically, pilots for China Airlines. China Airlines pilots strike for better conditions. Of course, that happened during the Chinese New Year. And here we've got the word strike, which can mean a lot of things. If you knock down all 10 pins when you're bowling, that's a strike. Or if you hit somebody, you could say you're striking them. Or you could say lightning strikes during lightning storms. But here, a strike means people are refusing to work until they get better pay or better working conditions. And we often say go on strike. A strike can be both a noun and a verb. We're striking for better wages. That's the verb form. Or we're going on strike. That would be the noun form.
Yeah, if you watch the news very much, you probably have seen people who are outside a place of business, maybe an office building, and they're holding signs, complaining about something, wanting something. Yeah, they strike for better conditions. We talk about conditions when we talk about what your job environment is like. Some people have to work in horrible conditions in third world countries or less developed countries. A lot of people are working in very hot factories. They don't get enough breaks. Lately, Amazon workers have been complaining about their work conditions. They don't get enough breaks. They're not paid enough. There's too much stress. So what these pilots did, they wanted to change things. So one of the things you can do as a worker, if you're in a union, they're called labor unions, is you can leave the job, you won't show up to work, and you tell your bosses, we're not coming back until we get what we want. And here they're going on strike, or they went on strike for better conditions. So let's look at this first paragraph. If you were traveling during the Chinese New Year vacation this year, that was probably bad for you if you had bought tickets on China Airlines because they were on strike. You were probably affected negatively by the China Airlines pilot strike. I did leave Taiwan during Chinese New Year this year. First time I've done it since I've been back to Taiwan. It's kind of nice to be home in America during Chinese New Year, but sadly, it's also a very popular time for Taiwanese people to go on vacation during Chinese New Year. They probably had a lot of angry customers.
But if you were traveling, of course, you may have been affected by the pilot strike. And more than 600 pilots working for the company went on strike starting February 8th to call for more reasonable working hours and better staffed flights. So here we've got the verb phrase to call for. That just means you're requesting something, you're demanding that this happen. So they're calling for reasonable working hours. That's what they want, basically. We don't want to work so much overtime. We're tired, we're exhausted, and that is affecting the quality of our work, and it could affect the safety of the passengers as well. So we've got to make this demand right now.
Yeah, it says here pilots complained of being overworked. If you're overworked, you just have too much. There's no way you can get everything done. I know, especially during the recession in 2008, 2009, a lot of people were laid off, and the people that were left working in a company had to do that work as well. So everybody was feeling overworked. And here we're saying they're overworked to the point of exhaustion. This is actually a phrase we use quite often where we want to explain how overworked they felt. So how overworked were they? They felt like they were going to just be exhausted or to the point, or that particular point of when you're just exhausted and you have no energy left. So that was their biggest complaint, I think, is they were just having to work too many hours. And they were not only exhausted, but a lot of the pilots were getting sick. So that's bad. And if you have those two things together, this poses or actually put you in an increased area for danger of accidents. So to pose a risk, you'll often hear us talk about that. If something poses a risk, it just means it sets up a situation where it's dangerous and you need to be careful. So the pilots were saying, we're working so much, it may lead to more accidents, and nobody wants that.
Okay, so you mentioned a labor union earlier, so
Yeah.
we've got one here called the Pilots Union Taoyuan, which of course is where the airport is. This union put forth 5 demands, including additional backup pilots for long-haul flights. So they put forth these demands. You could also say they put these demands forth, which means they mentioned these, they requested that these things be done.
Or you could just use call for right there.
You could, indeed. They called for
We used it earlier,
things.
so don't use it that close to something else. But yeah, put forth, called for.
They had 5 demands, and one of those demands included backup pilots or substitute pilots for long-haul flights if they're flying, say, from Taipei to Amsterdam or something like that. That's a long flight, so maybe they could have another pilot there to take over if one pilot gets exhausted. And the union and the airline reached a deal on Valentine's Day, February 14th. Oh, they were just so in love there when they came to that agreement. And the airline agreed to fulfill many of the union's demands. So hopefully we can get on our flights on time in the future and not be delayed by pilot strikes. I hope the flight attendants don't strike next.
Yeah. Usually you do have different groups who will put themselves or form a union together, like, flight attendants, they'll have their own union. Here the pilots decided to get together. You have more strength for your demands if you're negotiating in a big group. So that's why people form unions. Here's the last paragraph. It says, as the strike occurred or happened during the peak season for Taiwanese travelers, more than 20,000 passengers were affected by flight delays or cancellations. I'm surprised that not all of them were affected by just cancellations. So the strike actually happened during the peak season. Peak season can be different at different points in the year for different places. For example, I'm from a very hot state in the U.S. Our peak season is November to March. No one would ever want to go and visit Phoenix, Arizona in the summer. That's insane. It's so hot. Peak season, of course, for Taiwanese travelers would be during Chinese New Year because you guys get such a nice long vacation, which is really wonderful. It's too bad they decided to go on strike during this time. But you know why they did. They would have much more power to get their demands met. We often use that verb to meet someone's demands. So they put forth their demands and then had to wait to see if China Airlines Company would actually meet those demands or reject them.
Absolutely. And of course, as you know, this year's Chinese New Year holiday was longer than usual. So lots of people planned overseas vacations. So they were probably very disappointed when they found out that their flight was canceled. And public reactions ranged from sympathy for the overworked pilots to fury over the effect the strike had on travel plans. So first of all, they had sympathy. Some people felt sorry for the pilots. Yes, they are overworked. There's a lot of stress in that job.
Heck yeah.
They do deserve to get paid more. So that's sympathy, trying to feel the way somebody else feels. But other people, of course, understandably, we're furious. Here we've got furious, a noun, but the adjective is furious. I was furious because my flight was canceled. And that's understandable because a lot of these people work really hard. They save their money for their plane tickets, and this is the only time during the year they have off. And they were planning a vacation to Thailand or Japan or Bali or something, and now they can't go. They've got to tell the kids, sorry, Junior, we just can't go on our trip. But Daddy, you promised, and now we have to stay stay home. So, yes, they were very angry about that. So, there was a range of reactions to the pilot's strike.
Yeah, if you have sympathy for someone, you feel bad for them. You may not have been through the same experience. That would be the word empathy, which means you actually feel what they feel because you've been through it. But yeah, a lot of people felt really badly for the pilots. Those long-haul flights can go, 14, 15 hours. That's tough. And so I think it would be nice to have a couple of extra pilots sitting in the back, maybe, to give breaks to the two that are up front. So, yeah, if you feel fury, it means you're furious. Fury's a noun. If you're furious, it means you're really, really angry. Oh, I'm furious. So leave that word for times when you're really, really mad, really angry, not just a little upset. Furious means you're probably yelling at that point. So they felt a lot of fury. That's what some of the reactions range from sympathy to fury and the effect the strike had on travel plans. I'm sure there are a lot of disappointed families who didn't get to go on vacation because of the pilot strike. I feel bad for them. What did travel agencies have to say? Well, they asked China Airlines to compensate affected passengers. If you compensate something or compensate someone for something, it means you give them money because of some injury or some problem that happened that made their lives more difficult. A lot of times, people who have been hit by a car, for example, will sue the driver, and the driver will have to pay them money to compensate them for their injuries and to help them pay perhaps for lost wages. Maybe they couldn't work after they were in an accident. But here, let's see if the travel agencies actually get China Airlines to pay those passengers back for having missed that vacation.
Absolutely. And if a passenger paid 10,000 NT dollars for a round-trip ticket, I think they probably want more back than that as compensation. Hey, I planned this vacation and you screwed up our lives and we don't have another plan for the vacation. So we want more than just the price of the ticket. But hopefully China Airlines will, give them a refund or something like that. And with the strike now over, the airline and its workers hope for smoother flights going forward. Indeed, we certainly hope that this doesn't happen again. And it shouldn't have happened in the first place. We all want to have nice vacations, especially when we've been planning for them for such a long time. Okay, that brings us to the end of our lesson for today. And there's no Chinese teacher today, so we're just going to say bye directly. So thanks for joining us, and we hope you learned a lot. I know I did. From all of us here at English Digest, my name is Tom.
I'm Stephanie.
Goodbye.
Bye.